I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen Bee.
There was no grand announcement, no balcony appearance, and no warning delivered through palace channels. Instead, inside a private meeting room, a small group of trustees confirmed a decision powerful enough to redraw the emotional map of the royal family. Queen Camilla entered expecting clarification. She left devastated. The late Queen's family trust, she was told, would bypass her entirely and pass directly toward the future represented by Prince William's children. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla did not move when the chairman finished speaking. The Queen's Family Trust Committee, a fictional body in this dramatized account charged with protecting assets, heirlooms, investments, and legacy provisions, had decided. The trust would pass into a protected structure benefiting George, Charlotte, and Louis. She would receive no controlling seat, no inheritance authority, and no committee vote. This was not simply about wealth. It was about who the late monarch trusted to carry the family legacy forward. Charles watched his wife carefully as the meaning settled. The king understood that the decision cut deeper than money, because Camilla had spent years standing beside him, yet this private structure placed her outside the line of control. She finally asked whether anything could be reconsidered. He did not answer. The silence landed harder than any refusal. Across the table, William remained tense because he was learning something unsettling. The trust was not being handed to him personally. One trustee broke the silence by setting down a sealed summary folder. He explained that the arrangement had been activated by instructions written before Elizabeth II's death. Those directions had not come from William, Charles, or any current palace faction. The late Queen had built the protections herself. That revelation shifted the room, because the decision was no longer a dispute between living relatives. It had become a message from the previous reign. Camilla removed her reading glasses and placed them beside the untouched papers. "So there was never going to be a place for me," she said. Charles looked toward the trustees rather than correcting her. William lowered his eyes, aware that George, Charlotte, and Louis now stood at the center of a structure even their father could not freely command. The children were beneficiaries, but the prince was only a guardian of the rules surrounding them. That was when the question surfaced. Why had Elizabeth designed the trust this way long before her death? To understand that, the story had to move beyond the trustees and toward the people who discovered exactly where the late Queen believed the monarchy's future belonged. The trust decision was written in legal language, but its consequences were painfully human. For Charles, it placed duty against marriage. For William, it transformed his children into unexpected custodians of a legacy they were too young to fully understand. And for Camilla, the message felt brutally personal. She had spent years standing beside the monarch, yet one private decision from the previous reign seemed to draw a boundary she could never cross. William left the meeting without victory. The prince understood that George, Charlotte, and Louis were beneficiaries, meaning those protected to receive the trust. But their father was not its unrestricted owner. His role was closer to guardian than master. George carried special weight because he stood directly in the succession, the formal order determining who inherits the crown, while Charlotte and Louis represented continuity protected beyond a single future king. Later, William sat alone with Catherine and admitted what frightened him most. The future king was not worried about the assets. He feared resentment becoming attached to his children before they understood why. Catherine listened, then asked whether the trust could place her in a formal role. His answer was uneasy. Under the late Queen's conditions, she could become a protective guardian if he were unable to act, giving the Wales family another layer of control. Camilla found Charles in private that evening. The Queen consort told him she could have accepted receiving nothing personally. What hurt was being denied even an advisory place, because to her it suggested Elizabeth had never trusted where she belonged. The king tried to reassure her, but he learned something uncomfortable. The trust restricted a reigning sovereign, the monarch currently on the throne, from casually changing its destination. His crown could not erase his mother's instructions. That truth followed Charles afterward. He began asking not how to overturn the arrangement, but why Elizabeth had made it so difficult to overturn. the king sensed legal caution alone did not explain the precision of the restrictions. Something had happened before her death, something strong enough to make her protect the grandchildren from interference by those closest to the throne. William faced that weight at home when he found George finishing schoolwork. The prince almost spoke. He almost explained that part of the family's private legacy was tied to his future. Instead, he said nothing. George was still a child. William closed the study door softly and walked away, knowing adulthood had reached toward his son too early. And behind Charles's growing questions waited a forgotten family gathering, one uncomfortable conversation the palace had once treated as insignificant, until the trustees' ruling made every word spoken that night matter. Years before anyone imagined a trust dispute, one private dinner altered the late queen's thinking. There were no lawyers in the room, and no formal declarations. Only family, tradition, and a question about what would happen when another generation inherited responsibility. But one exchange left Elizabeth unusually silent. Those present moved on. She did not. What seemed like an uncomfortable conversation became the specific trigger behind safeguards that would one day leave Camilla staring at a closed door. Elizabeth began that evening warmly, allowing old family memories to soften the room before the discussion changed. The Queen spoke about private family property, personal assets held outside the Crown's official duties, and why certain pieces, funds, and residences carried meaning beyond money. She reminded Charles that much of what remained had passed through her parents and Prince Philip. To her, those holdings belonged emotionally to generations, not simply to whoever happened to hold the highest title. Camilla then asked the question nobody forgot. Once Charles became king, she wondered aloud whether the wider household should consolidate control of private family assets under the sovereign and consort to avoid competing centers of influence. The queen consort's future role, meaning the spouse who supports a reigning king without inheriting his constitutional powers, was still years away. Yet William stiffened immediately. The prince answered carefully that anything intended for grandchildren should remain protected for them, regardless of who occupied the throne. Charles tried to soften the exchange, telling his mother that Camilla was speaking about efficiency, not ownership. But Elizabeth stopped eating. Catherine noticed first. The monarch placed her fork beside her plate and said quietly, "Some things must survive us rather than belong to us." Nobody challenged her. Later, Catherine told William privately that the Queen's expression had changed the instant consolidation was mentioned. He agreed. Both sensed that the conversation had crossed an invisible line. Weeks later, Elizabeth summoned 2 longtime advisors and began revising the trust's protective clauses. Those clauses, binding rules controlling how the trust could operate, shifted authority toward descendants rather than the sovereign household. Trustees would later find handwritten instructions stating that future spouses of monarchs or heirs should not automatically control assets reserved for grandchildren. Charles now understood the consequence. Camilla's question had not created hostility, but it may have triggered caution strong enough to shape the final structure. The king could sympathize with his wife while still recognizing why his mother had acted decisively. That truth could not remain buried in an old dinner conversation. And when Charles finally entered Camilla's private sitting room to discuss it, years of unspoken insecurity came crashing into a single confrontation. Charles had defended Camilla through decades of scrutiny, but this time, the challenge came from someone he could neither confront nor persuade: his late mother. Behind a closed palace door, husband and wife finally spoke without advisors, secretaries, or carefully prepared language. Camilla wanted one answer. Charles feared giving it, because if Elizabeth had deliberately protected the trust from future consorts, then the trustees had not merely excluded Camilla, they had preserved a judgment from beyond the grave. Charles entered the sitting room, carrying the trustee summary, and Camilla understood before he spoke. The king had traced the trust back to the Windsor dinner, and now knew why the safeguards had hardened afterward. He explained that the clauses applied to royal spouses generally. A clause is a binding rule written into a legal arrangement, and these rules were designed to stop any consort from automatically gaining control. But she heard something colder. Elizabeth drafted them, while knowing Camilla would one day stand beside her son as queen consort. Camilla looked at him and asked the question he had dreaded. "Did your mother never trust me?" Charles repeated softly, almost as if testing the words before answering. The monarch refused to turn Elizabeth's decision into a verdict on affection. He said his mother had always separated personal warmth from institutional protection. Camilla shook her head. To her, the distinction felt empty. She had served beside him for years, yet the trust treated her like a temporary presence beside a permanent bloodline. Charles then revealed the detail he had hoped to avoid. In the trustee's summary, Elizabeth had barred any reigning monarch from appointing a spouse to the trust committee without unanimous trustee approval. Unanimous approval meant every trustee had to agree. One refusal was enough to stop the appointment. The king admitted he had already asked whether Camilla could receive even a limited advisory role. The answer had been no. Camilla rose so quickly that her chair scraped backward. "You knew there was nothing you could do before you came in here?" she asked. Charles lowered the file. Yes, that single word wounded more deeply than the ruling. She realized he had carried the failure alone because he already understood entirely what it would mean to her. Silence replaced anger. Camilla turned away, and Charles stopped trying to defend the past. The king left with one new determination. If his mother's wishes could overrule him, he wanted to know exactly who possessed that authority. Camilla believed the crown should have carried the final word, but beyond the palace apartments sat a quieter power, one designed to remain unmoved, even when the monarch personally wanted a different outcome. Royal power can command ceremonies, appoint officials, and shape an institution, but private inheritance can obey an entirely different set of rules. Charles entered the trustees' chamber as king, yet the people waiting across the table were not there to seek his permission. Their responsibility belonged to a document signed under the previous reign, and when the monarch asked whether Camilla could receive even a ceremonial seat, one trustee delivered the answer nobody expected him to hear: no. Charles sat down knowing rank would not settle this. The trustees operated under the late Queen's settlement, a private legal arrangement controlling how family assets would be protected and passed on. Their fiduciary duty, meaning a binding obligation to act for the beneficiaries rather than please powerful relatives, prevented them from changing the trust because palace relationships had shifted. The king understood the rule. He hated what it meant. William watched his father as the chairman explained the scope of the arrangement. The trust covered investments, residences, private collections, and transfers to George, Charlotte, and Louis, under conditions tied to age and responsibility. The prince was invited to speak. He hesitated. Supporting the structure protected his children, but sounding enthusiastic would wound Charles and deepen Camilla's sense that the Wales family had gained from her exclusion. Charles tapped one finger against the table, then stopped himself. The king asked whether any compromise remained. The lead trustee answered by pointing to Elizabeth's non-interference direction, a written instruction requiring administrators to resist emotional, political, or royal pressure to redirect the assets. She had anticipated that future reigns might want different outcomes. Her solution was simple and severe. The trust must survive those pressures. William then heard another restriction. Decisions involving George, Charlotte, and Louis had to protect their independence from the reigning household. That meant even their father could not treat the trust like ordinary family property. The future king looked toward Charles, because the message had become unmistakable. Nobody at that table owned the arrangement. They were all being restrained by someone no longer present. Charles finally asked the question that stripped away ceremony. Would his signature as sovereign change anything? The chairman closed the folder and answered calmly that, on this matter, the monarch's signature carried no authority. William saw his father's jaw tighten. The king said nothing more. Charles left without overturning a single clause. The legal battle had ended before it truly began. But the harder consequence was waiting outside that room. Camilla now had to return to royal life, knowing everyone closest to the family understood where the boundary had been drawn. And the next morning, that humiliation would follow her into every duty. The most devastating consequences did not arrive with shouting. They appeared the next morning in familiar routines that suddenly felt different. Staff still bowed. Engagement papers still waited. Cars still arrived at the palace entrance. Yet Camilla understood that behind those ordinary rituals, something fundamental had changed. She remained queen beside Charles, but the late queen's private legacy had been deliberately routed elsewhere, and everybody closest to the family now understood that the exclusion could not be reversed. Camilla entered the morning briefing quieter than anyone expected. The palace had decided there would be no immediate public statement, because officials wanted the trust treated as a private family matter rather than a constitutional dispute, meaning a conflict about the formal powers of the monarchy. She listened as schedules were reviewed. Then an aide mentioned a future heritage initiative involving George, Charlotte, and Louis. The queen consort paused. Everyone noticed. After a long second, she simply said, "Continue." Charles watched her through the rest of the meeting. The king knew he could not change Elizabeth's instructions, yet guilt followed every ordinary exchange. Camilla answered questions, approved timings, and moved through duty with discipline, but he could see the damage beneath it. Every mention of the Wales children now seemed to remind her that the late queen's private legacy had been protected somewhere she could never enter. William, meanwhile, ordered his office to show no triumph. The prince insisted that George, Charlotte, and Louis must not become symbols in an adult dispute. Catherine then received a confidential explanation of her contingency role, a backup guardianship that would allow her to protect the children's interests if William could no longer act. She immediately asked whether accepting it might look hostile toward Camilla. He answered that the clause was automatic. Refusing it would not empower the queen consort, it would only weaken the safeguards around their children. Camilla remained alone after the briefing ended. She noticed an old handwritten Christmas card from Elizabeth nearby and reached toward it, then stopped. Her hand hovered for a moment, before slowly withdrawing. Charles saw the gesture from the doorway and said nothing. He understood that grief and rejection had become tangled together. William made his decision that evening. Rather than send another message through courtiers, the prince asked to meet Camilla privately. No Charles, no Catherine, no advisors. Neither could hide behind procedure now. Whatever survived this conversation would have to survive because they chose it. For the first time since the trustees delivered their verdict, the woman who felt excluded and the man whose children had inherited the future would face each other without anyone else available to absorb the tension. William could have allowed the trustees to speak for him. He could have hidden behind legal language, avoided discomfort, and waited for the anger to fade. Instead, he entered Camilla's room alone. No advisors, no Charles, no Catherine, no folders between them. The conversation would not alter one clause of the late Queen's trust, but it could determine whether the decision fractured the family permanently, or whether two people trapped on opposite sides of Elizabeth's wishes could finally separate inheritance from personal loyalty. William spoke first, because hesitation would only make the meeting harder. The prince told Camilla he had not requested the arrangement, and had learned about several protective clauses only when the trustees formally briefed him. A protective clause is a binding rule designed to prevent later changes, and these rules limited his power as much as hers. He stressed that George, Charlotte, and Louis would not control the assets immediately. The settlement was long-term stewardship, meaning responsibility held for the future rather than a personal reward. For both of them, that distinction mattered, because the children would eventually inherit not only assets, but expectations. Camilla listened without interrupting, then finally admitted what hurt most. The queen consort said she could survive receiving nothing. What she struggled to accept was the idea that Elizabeth had imagined a future royal structure in which she was simply unnecessary. William did not pretend to know his grandmother's private feelings. Instead, he said the late monarch often protected the institution from positions, not individuals, because positions outlast marriages, loyalties, and even affection. Camilla then asked the question that could have shattered the fragile calm. Would William ever support changing the arrangement? The prince answered no. He explained that overruling Elizabeth would teach his children the wrong lesson, that inherited responsibility could be rewritten whenever it became painful or inconvenient. He was not trying to defeat Camilla. He was trying to carry something he believed his grandmother had deliberately placed beyond personal preference. That answer changed her. Camilla no longer heard triumph in his refusal. She heard burden. For the first time, the queen consort understood that William had not gained freedom from the trust. He had inherited limits with it. Silence held between them before Camilla finally said, "Then protect it properly." William nodded. She did not embrace him. She did not apologize. But when the prince stood to leave, she told him she would not ask Charles to challenge the trustees again. Inside the palace, the temperature had finally fallen. Their private truce had ended the family battle, just as the secret arrangement escaped beyond those walls. And outside the gates, the story was only beginning to explode. By sunrise, the dispute was no longer private. The words "Queen's trust bypasses Camilla" dominated conversation, and a family arrangement that had unfolded behind closed doors became a public symbol of succession, loyalty, and Elizabeth's final influence. Commentators argued over whether Camilla had been rejected or whether the late monarch had simply protected her grandchildren. Yet one image outside Buckingham Palace captured the mood better than any studio debate. 3 young names printed beneath Elizabeth's photograph. Charles reacted first with anger. The king hated headlines claiming he had lost control of his own family, because the phrase turned a private inheritance decision into a public test of royal authority. Palace officials refused to discuss financial details, hoping silence would keep the trust inside the family. Instead, that silence created space for interpretations. One side called Camilla's exclusion humiliating. Another described the arrangement as a generational safeguard, meaning a structure designed to protect assets for younger heirs, rather than the adults currently holding power. Camilla surprised Charles by stopping him from answering back. The queen consort reminded him of the promise she had made to William, and insisted that any public rebuttal would drag George, Charlotte, and Louis deeper into a conflict they had not created. Charles remained furious, but he listened. For once, she was no longer fighting to prove she belonged inside the trust. She was protecting the boundary she had finally agreed to respect. William became protective when broadcasters repeatedly showed his children. The prince instructed his team to stress that the 3 young royals were beneficiaries, not combatants in a family struggle. Catherine's contingency role also became public knowledge. That role, a backup responsibility allowing her to safeguard the children's interests if William could not, strengthened the impression that the Wales household had been entrusted with stewardship rather than handed a prize. Public attention then shifted. Analysts began focusing less on Camilla's loss and more on Elizabeth's foresight. The late queen had created a structure capable of surviving new reigns, marriages, loyalties, and personal pressure. What first looked like rejection now looked to many like long-term planning. Outside Buckingham Palace, evening papers carried a fictional front page reading "Elizabeth's Last Family Line" beneath photographs of George, Charlotte, and Louis. Tourists stopped to photograph it as broadcasters called the trust a message aimed decades into the future. Charles watched the coverage beside Camilla, waiting for anger. Camilla gave him something else. She decided there would be no lawyers, no public statement, and no final challenge. The story had begun with her asking what had been taken from her. It would end with her deciding what she was prepared to stop fighting for. In the end, nobody overturned the trust. No emergency intervention came from Charles. William did not surrender the protections surrounding his children. The trustees did not compromise Elizabeth's instructions. Yet the final outcome was not simply that Camilla lost. Something more complicated happened. After days of anger, humiliation, and private confrontation, she accepted that the late queen's final boundary belonged to another generation, and chose to stop measuring her place beside Charles by whether Elizabeth had included her in a document. Camilla made the first move toward closure. The queen consort told Charles she did not want him approaching the trustees again, and this time there was no anger behind the request. The trustees formally recorded that no challenge would be pursued. Their settlement, meaning the private legal structure governing the trust, remained intact for George, Charlotte, and Louis. William would continue under its safeguards, while Catherine retained her contingency role if he could no longer act. The arrangement was final. Charles accepted something harder than defeat. The king understood that sovereign authority, the formal power attached to the reigning monarch, did not make every private family decision his to rewrite. His mother had drawn a line between crown power and family ownership, and he finally stopped trying to cross it. Camilla's sadness remained, but she knew another challenge would place her marriage against Elizabeth's memory and against children who had done nothing to create the conflict. William responded with equal restraint. The prince refused any suggestion that his household had won. He understood that George, Charlotte, and Louis had inherited responsibility, not a weapon. Their protection existed precisely because Elizabeth wanted certain assets removed from the emotional struggles of whoever happened to occupy the throne. The future king accepted that burden without celebration. Camilla finally saw the distinction that had wounded her from the beginning. Elizabeth had not protected the future from one woman alone. The late queen had protected it from the office of royal consort itself, a position held by the spouse of a reigning monarch. Personal affection could change, marriages could change, reigns could change. The boundary was designed to survive all of them. Camilla handed Charles the trustee's summary she had kept since the first meeting. "Put it with the family records," she said. The king took it, squeezed her hand, and neither spoke about reopening the decision again. That was the final verdict. George, and Charlotte, and Louis inherited protection. William inherited responsibility. Charles accepted the limits of power. Camilla accepted that belonging to the monarchy did not mean possessing every part of its past. What devastated Camilla at first ultimately forced the entire family to confront a harder truth. Elizabeth's final act was not about deciding who mattered least. It was about deciding what had to outlive them all. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.